Part II of Ghosts and Family Legends, a volume for Christmas, by Catherine Crowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part II, Round the Fire, Second Evening. "After the doctor's story, I fear mine will appear too trifling," said Mrs. M., "but as it is the only circumstance of the kind that ever happened to myself, I prefer giving it to you to any of the many stories I have heard. About 15 years ago, I was staying with some friends at a magnificent old seat in Yorkshire, and our host, being very much crippled with the gout, was in the habit of driving about the park and neighbourhood in a low pony phaeton, on which occasions I often accompanied him. One of our favourite excursions was to the ruins of an old abbey just beyond the park, and we generally returned by a remarkably pretty rural lane leading to the village, or rather small town of C. One fine summer's evening we had just entered this lane, when, seeing the hedges full of wild flowers, I asked my friend to let me alight and gather some. I walked on before the carriage, picking honeysuckles and roses as I went along, till I came to a gate that led into a field. It was a common country gate, with a post on each side, and on one of these posts sat a large white cat, the finest animal of the kind I had ever seen; and as I have a weakness for cats, I stopped to admire this sleek fat puss, looking so wonderfully comfortable in a very uncomfortable position, the top of the post on which it was sitting, with its feet doubled up under it, being out of all proportion to its body, for no Angola ever rivalled it in size. "Come on gently," I called to my friend, "here's such a magnificent cat," for I feared the approach of the phaeton would startle it away before he had seen it. "Where?" said he, pulling up his horse opposite the gate. "There," said I, pointing to the post. "Isn't it a beauty? I wonder if it would let me stroke it." "I see no cat," said he. "There, on the post," said I; but he declared he saw nothing, though puss sat there in perfect composure during this colloquy. "Don't you see the cat, James?" said I, in great perplexity, to the groom. "Yes, ma'am, a large white cat on the post." I thought my friend must be joking, or else losing his eyesight, and I approached the cat, intending to take it in my arms, and carry it to the carriage. But as I drew near, she jumped off the post, which was natural enough; but to my surprise she jumped into nothing. As she jumped she disappeared. No cat in the field, none in the lane, none in the ditch. "Where did she go, James?" "I don't know, ma'am, I can't see her," said the groom, standing up in his seat and looking all around. I was quite bewildered, but still I had no glimmering of the truth, and when I got into the carriage again, my friend said he thought I and James were dreaming, and I retorted that I thought he must be going blind. I had a commission to execute as we passed through the town, and I alighted for that purpose at the little haberdasher's, and while they were serving me I mentioned that I had seen a remarkably beautiful cat sitting on a gate in the lane, and asked if they could tell me who it belonged to, adding it was the largest cat I ever saw. The owners of the shop and two women who were making purchase suspended their proceedings, looked at each other, and then looked at me, evidently very much surprised. "Was it a white cat, ma'am?" said the mistress. "Yes, a white cat, a beautiful creature, and—" "Bless me!" cried two or three, "the lady's seen the white cat of C. It hasn't been seen these 20 years." "Master wishes to know if you'll soon be done, ma'am. The pony is getting restless," said James. Of course I hurried out and got into the carriage, telling my friend that the cat was well known to the people at C, and that it was 20 years old. In those days, I believe, I never thought of ghosts, and least of all should I have thought of the ghost of a cat; but 2 evenings afterwards, as we were driving down the lane, I again saw the cat in the same position, and again my companion could not see it, though the groom did. I alighted immediately and went up to it. As I approached, it turned its head, and looked full towards me with its soft mild eyes and a kindly expression, like that of a loving dog, and then, without moving from the post, it began to fade gradually away, as if it were a vapour, till it had quite disappeared. All this the groom saw as well as myself, and now there could be no mistake as to what it was. A third time I saw it in broad daylight, and my curiosity greatly awakened, I resolved to make further inquiries amongst the inhabitants of C., but before I had an opportunity of doing so, I was summoned away by the death of my eldest child, and I have never been in that part of the world since. However, I once mentioned the circumstance to a lady who was acquainted with that neighbourhood, and she said she had heard of the White Cat of C., but had never seen it. But as you may not think this story very interesting, since it only relates to a cat, I will, if you please, tell you another, in which I was concerned, although I saw nothing myself." "We shall be very happy," I said, "but I am far from thinking your story wanting in interest. In fact, to me it has a very peculiar interest. There are few friends so sincere as the animals who have loved us, and none that I, for my part, more earnestly desire to see again. I have had 2 dogs in my life, who contributed much to my happiness while they lived, and never caused me a sorrow till they died. Besides, there is a deep mystery in the being of these creatures, which proud man never seeks to unravel, or condescends to speculate on. What is their relation to the human race? Why are these spiritual germs embodied in those forms, and made subject to man, that hard and cruel master, who assumes to be their superior because he is endowed with some higher faculties, the most of which he grossly misuses? How beautiful are their characters when studied, how wonderful their intelligence when cultivated, how willing they are to serve us when kindly treated! But man, by his cruelty, ignorance, laziness, and want of judgment, spoils their temper, blunts their intelligence, deteriorates their nature, and then punishes them for being what he himself has made them. Well might Chalmers exclaim, 'All nature groans beneath the cruelty of man.' Why are these creatures, sinless as far as we can see, placed here as the subjects of this barbarous, unthinking tyrant? That has always appeared to me a solemn question." After this little digression, Mrs. M. continued as follows: "I had been travelling on the Continent, and was staying at Brussels on my way home. The bedroom I occupied was within another, in which slept my faithful maid Rachel, and one of my children. I had been in bed some time, and had not been to sleep, when I heard Rachel's voice saying something which I did not distinctly hear, and before I could ask what it was, she uttered a cry that immediately brought me to her bedside. I found her in a state of violent agitation, and as soon as she was composed enough to speak, she told me that she had not been long in bed when she heard a voice call her, which she supposed to be mine, and immediately afterwards, in the glass which was opposite the foot of the bed, she saw a figure in white enter and proceed to the other end of the room. She concluded it was me in my night dress, and that I had only mentioned her name to ascertain if she was awake. Fearing to disturb the child, who was restless, she lay still and did not answer. The figure went back through the door, but presently returned again, and seemed to be looking about for something, whereupon she half sat up in bed; and when it approached and laid its hand heavily on her knee, there was something painful in the pressure, and she exclaimed, 'Oh, don't do that, ma'am!' But she had scarcely uttered the words when she discerned the features, and saw it was her sister. The phantom looked sadly at her, and then retreating to the opposite corner, disappeared. This circumstance, in spite of my arguments and suggestions that it was a dream, made a very painful impression on her. She felt sure some misfortune had happened, and so it proved. Her sister had died on that night, leaving a family of young children, about whom in her last moments she was very anxious." "Cases of that sort are very numerous," said Lady A. "I know of 2 which I can give upon perfectly good authority. A friend of mine was sitting a few years since in the drawing room at her country seat. There was a door at each end leading to the other rooms, both of which were open. A slight rustle caused her to raise her eyes from her work, when she saw her nephew enter at one door, walk straight through, and out at the other. The young man was at college, and she had no reason to expect him then, but concluding some unforeseen business had brought him, and that he was in search of her, she called, "Arthur, here I am," and pursued him into the adjoining room, and then into the hall. Receiving no answer, and not being able to find him in any direction, she rang for the servants, and inquired where he was, but they did not know. They had seen nothing of him. She insisted he had arrived, and he was sought for all over the house and grounds in vain. The thing remained perfectly incomprehensible till the post brought a letter, announcing that the young man had been drowned on that day. Another instance, equally well established, is that of Dr. C. of Dublin. He resided with his family some few miles from the city, I believe, at or near Howth, and when he returned in the evening after visiting his patients, he frequently, to save time, took a short cut across some sands, which in certain states of the tide were not always safe. Mrs. C. had often entreated him to relinquish this practice, and take the more circuitous way, but he thought he was too well acquainted with the place to run any danger. One evening that they were expecting him, as usual, to dinner, his brother, who was standing at the window, saw him arrive. He rode a white horse, and was therefore a conspicuous object. When the dinner hour came, as he had not appeared in the drawing room, his brother and Mrs. C., to whom the latter had mentioned having seen him, desired the servants to seek him in his dressing room, and ask if he was ready. He was not in his room, nor was he anywhere to be found. Neither had any of the servants seen him, nor was his horse in the stable. Mr. C., however, confident of his arrival, suggested that he might be gone to visit some sick person in the neighbourhood, so they waited, but in vain. News presently arrived that horse and man had been drowned that evening in crossing the sands. There was scarcely any one present unacquainted with examples of this kind of appearance amongst their family or friends, but Captain L. related to us a case still more curious and unaccountable that had happened to himself in India when he was in the Himalaya. "I was just finishing my breakfast one morning," said he, "when my servant entered and announced a visitor. It was Captain P.B. of ours, who came to invite me to a game of billiards. Our billiard room was situated about a mile beyond my quarter, and Captain B., who lived at the other extremity, had to pass my residence to go to it. "'Are you going up there now?' I said. "'Yes,' said he. "'Will you come?' "'Why, I can't come directly,' I answered, "'for I have a letter to write first, but if you'll go on, I'll join you presently.' He left me, and as soon as I had written my letter, I started for the billiard room. When I entered it, Captain P.B. was not there, nor, indeed, anybody but the marker, which was not surprising, as it was earlier than we usually went there. "'Where's Captain B?' I said. "'Don't know, sir. He has not been here yet.' "'Not been here?' "'No, sir, not to day.' Thinking that as I was not yet ready, he had filled up the interval by going somewhere else, I began knocking about the balls, every now and then looking out the window, expecting to see him approach. But when this had lasted upwards of 2 hours, I began to be rather impatient, and was just thinking of going away, when I saw him approaching with his wife in an open carriage from an opposite direction. "'A pretty fellow you are, to keep me kicking my heels here, waiting for you,' said I, as he entered the room. "'Keep you waiting?' he said. 'I have not kept you waiting. Why, I've been here these 2 hours and more.' "'How was I to know that? I did not know you were coming up here.' "'Why, I told you I'd come as soon as I had finished my letter.' "'My dear fellow, what are you talking about?' exclaimed my friend, in evident surprise. 'When did you tell me so? I don't recollect making any appointment to meet you to day.' "'What! Not this morning as you were passing my quarter?' said I, amazed in my turn. 'Didn't you ask me to come and play a game at billiards, and didn't I tell you I'd come as soon as I had finished my letter? And I did.' P.B. looked at me as if he thought I'd suddenly become insane; but as I suppose my countenance did not confirm that impression, he said, 'Here's some mistake. When do you suppose I made this appointment with you?' "'Suppose!' I answered, rather indignant. 'What do you mean by suppose? Didn't you come into my quarter about 3 hours ago, just as I was finishing breakfast, and ask me to come up here and play a game at billiards with you?" "No, it must have been somebody else. Who gave you the message?" "Message? There was no message," I answered, quite bewildered. "You came in yourself. You know you did. What's the use of trying to hoax one?" "I don't know whether you are trying to hoax me," replied Pippie, "but upon my soul I have not been in your quarter to day, nor have I seen you at all, till I entered this room. Moreover, I went with my wife at an early hour to breakfast with Captain D., and we are now returning thence, and I told the coachman to set me down here as he passed." This was most confounding, and as we were both equally positive in what we asserted, we left the billiard room together, and proceeded to take the testimony of my servant. On being asked who he had introduced when I was finishing breakfast, he unhesitatingly answered Captain B. His account, in short, coincided entirely with mine. "Now then," said Captain B., "as you have your witness, you must hear mine." And we went on to his quarter, where I received the most satisfactory and unimpeachable evidence that what he said was correct. He had left home with Mrs. B. at 6 o'clock, and gone by appointment to breakfast with Captain D., who lived quite in a different direction to my quarter; and Captain D. afterwards testified to his never having left his house till he stepped into the carriage with his wife. This event created a great sensation at the time, and people endeavoured by every means to explain it away, but nobody ever could. Captain B. did not like it at all, and his wife and family were very much alarmed, but nothing ensued, and I believe he is alive and well at this moment. We next turned to Madame Von B., who said she knew so many cases of spiritual appearances and occurrences of that nature, that she was rather perplexed by the abundance of her recollections. Among these she selected the following on account of its singularity. "We resided a great deal on the Continent before I was married, and my mother had a favourite maid called Françoise, who lived with her many years, a most trustworthy, excellent creature, in whom she had the greatest confidence; insomuch that when I married, being very young and very inexperienced, as she was obliged to separate from me herself, she transferred Françoise to my service, considering her better able to take care of me than anybody else. I was living in Paris then, where Françoise, who was a native of Metz, had some relations settled in business, whom she often used to visit. She was generally very chatty when she returned from these people, for I knew all her affairs, and through her all their affairs, and I took an interest in whatever concerned her or hers. One Sunday evening, after she had been spending the afternoon with this family, observing that she was unusually silent, I said to her, while she was undressing me, "Well, Françoise, haven't you anything to tell me? How are your friends? Has Madame Pelletier got rid of her grippe?" Françoise started as if I had awakened her out of a reverie, and said, "Oh, oui, madame, oui, merci. Elle se porte bien aujourd'hui." "And Monsieur Pelletier and the children, are they very well?" "Oui, madame, merci. Ils se portent bien." These curt answers were so unlike those she generally gave me, that I was sure her mind was preoccupied, and that something had happened since we parted in the morning. So I turned around to look her in the face, saying, "Mais qu'avez-vous donc, Françoise? Qu'est-ce qu'il y a?" Then I saw, what I had not observed before, that she was very pale, and that her cheeks had a glazed look, which showed that she had been crying. "Mais, ma bonne Françoise," I said, "vous avez quelque chose. Est-il arrivé quelque malheur à Metz?" "C'est cela, madame," answered Françoise, who had a brother there, whom she had not seen for several years, but to whom she still continued affectionately attached. His name was Benoît, and he was in a good service as garde forestier to a nobleman who possessed very extensive estates, près de chez nous, as Françoise said. He had a wife and children, and some time before the period I am referring to, Françoise had told me with great satisfaction that in order to make him more comfortable, The Prince de had given Benoît the privilege of gathering up all the dead wood in the forest to sell for firewood, which, as the estate was very large, rendered his situation extremely profitable. When she said, "C'est cela, madame," Françoise, who had just encased me in my dressing gown, sunk into a chair, and having declared that she was bête, très bête, she gave way to a hearty good cry, after which, being somewhat relieved, she told me the following strange story. "You remember," she said, "that the Prince was so good as to give Benoît all the dead wood of the forest, and a great thing it was for him and his family, as you will think, when I tell you it was worth upwards of 2,000 francs a year to him. In short, he was growing rich, and perhaps he was getting to think too much of his money and too little of the bon Dieu. At all events, this privilege which the Prince gave him, to make him comfortable, and which made him a great man amongst the foresters, has been the cause of a dreadful calamity." "How?" said I. "We never heard anything of what had happened," said she, "till yesterday, when Monsieur Pelletier received a letter from Benoît's wife, and another from a cousin of hers, relating what I am going to tell you, and saying that both he and his family had wished to keep it secret, but that was no longer possible." "Well, and what has happened?" "La chose la plus incroyable! Eh bien, madame, it appears that one day last autumn Benoît went out in the forest to gather the dead wood. He had his cart with him, and as he gathered it, he bound it into faggots and threw it in the cart. He had extended his search this day to a remote part of the forest, and found himself in a spot he did not remember to have visited before. Indeed, it was evident to him that he had not, or he could not have escaped seeing an old wooden cross which was lying on the ground, and had apparently fallen into that recumbent position from old age. It was such a cross as is usually set up where a life has been lost, whether by murder or suicide, or sometimes when poor wanderers are frozen to death or lost in the deep winter snows. He looked about for the grave, but saw no indication of one, and he tried to remember if any catastrophe had happened there in his time, but could recall none. He took up the cross and examined it. He saw that the wood was decayed, and it bore such marks of antiquity that he had no doubt the person whose grave it had marked had died before he was born. It looked as if it might be 100 years old." "Eh bien," said Françoise, wiping her eyes, into which the tears kept starting, "of course you will think that Benoît, or anybody in the world who had the fear of God before his eyes, as he could not find the grave to replace it as it should be, would have laid it reverently down where he had found it, saying a prayer for the soul of the deceased. But, alas! the demon of avarice tempted him, and he had not the heart to forego that poor cross, but bound it up into a faggot with the rest of the dead wood he found there, and threw it into his cart." "Well, Françoise," said I, "you know I am not a Catholic, but I respect the custom of erecting these crosses, and I do think your brother was very wrong. I suppose he has lost the Prince's favour by such impious greediness?" "Pire que ça! Worse than that," she replied. "It appears that while he was committing this wicked action, he felt an extraordinary chill come over him, which made him think that though it had been a mild day, the evening must have suddenly turned very cold, and hastily throwing the faggot into his cart, he directed his steps homeward. But walk as he would, he still felt this chill down his back, so that he turned his head to look where the wind blew from, when he saw, with some dismay, a mysterious-looking figure following close upon his footsteps. It moved noiselessly on, and was covered with a sort of black mantle that prevented his discerning the features. Not liking its appearance, he jumped into the cart, and drove home as fast as he could, without looking behind him; and when he got into his own farmyard he felt quite relieved, particularly as when he alighted he saw no more of this unpleasant-looking stranger. So he began unloading his cart, taking out the faggots one by one, and throwing them upon the ground. But when he threw down the one that contained the cross, he received a blow upon his face so sharp that made him stagger and involuntarily shout aloud. His wife and children were close by, but there was no one else to be seen, and they would have disbelieved him and fancied he had accidentally hit himself with a faggot, but that they saw the distinct mark on his cheek of a blow given with an open hand. However, he went into supper perplexed and uncomfortable; but when he went to bed this fearful phantom stood by his side, silent and terrible, visible to him, but invisible to others. In short, madame, this awful figure haunted him till, in spite of his shame, he resolved to consult our cousin Jerome about it. But Jerome laughed, and said it was all fancy and superstition. "You got frightened at having brought away this poor devil's cross, and then you fancy he's haunting you," said he. But Benoît declared that he had thought nothing about the cross, except that it would make firewood, and that he had no more believed in ghosts than Jerome. "But now," said he, "something must be done. I can get no sleep, and am losing my health. If you can't help me, I must go to the priest and consult him." "Why don't you take back the cross and put it where you found it?" said Jerome. "Because I am afraid to touch it, and dare not go to that part of the forest." So Jerome, who did not believe a word about the ghost, offered to go with him and replace the cross. Benoît gladly accepted, more especially as he said he saw the apparition standing even then beside him, apparently listening to the conversation. Jerome laughed at the idea. However, Benoît lifted the cross reverently into the cart, and away they went into the forest. When they reached the spot, Benoît pointed out the tree under which he had found it, and as he was shaking and trembling, Jerome took up the cross and laid it on the ground. But as he did so, he received a violent blow from an invisible hand, and at the same moment saw Benoît fall to the ground. He thought he had been struck too, but it afterwards appeared that he had fainted from having seen the phantom with its upraised hand striking his cousin. However, they left the cross and came away; but there was an end to Jerome's laughter, and he was afraid the apparition would now haunt him. Nothing of the sort happened, but poor Benoît's health has been so shaken by this frightful occurrence that he cannot get the better of it. His friends have advised change of scene, and he is coming to Paris next week. This is the story that Françoise told me, and in a few days I heard he had arrived, and was staying with Monsieur Pelletier; but the shock had been too great for his nerves, and he died shortly after. They assured me that previous to that fatal expedition into the forest he had been a hale, hearty man, totally exempt from superstitious fancies of any sort, and, in short, wholly devoted to advancing his worldly prosperity and getting money. Part 2